Imagine walking into a village thousands of years ago with something valuable in your hands. But there is one problem. There is no money. No coins, no bank, no price tags, not even a piece of paper telling you what anything is worth. You have meat, but you need salt. The person with salt wants something else. So how do you make the trade happen? Ancient humans somehow built entire networks of exchange without the money system we take for granted today. But the surprising part is, they did not simply trade one thing for another. Once money does not exist, every exchange becomes a problem that has to be solved. Imagine you are an ancient hunter with a fresh supply of meat. You need salt, but the person who has salt does not want meat. They need stone tools. The person with the tools wants fish, and the person with the fish wants something completely different. Nobody has done anything wrong. Everyone has something useful. But the trade still cannot happen. This is one of the biggest problems with simple barter. For a trade to work directly, both sides have to want what the other person has at the same time. Economists later gave this problem a name: the double coincidence of wants. Ancient humans obviously did not use that phrase, but they had to deal with the problem itself, and they had more than one way around it. Sometimes the answer was simply to find another person. If the salt trader did not want your meat, perhaps someone else did. You could trade the meat with them and then use what you received to get closer to what you actually wanted. That sounds simple, but it becomes much harder as the number of people and goods increases. Imagine a small community where people produce different things. One person hunts, another fishes. Someone makes pottery, someone works stone, another gathers plants or produces food. The more specialized these people become, the more they depend on exchange. You cannot personally make everything you need. That creates a powerful reason to trade, but trade did not always mean that two strangers had to make a perfect one for one exchange. People also lived in relationships where favors, gifts, and obligations could matter. If someone helped you today, you might help them later. If a family gave you food when your hunting failed, you might return the favor when your luck improved. No coin was required. The value was partly in the relationship itself. This is important because it changes the way we should picture ancient economies. They were not simply primitive versions of a modern shop where everything had a fixed price. Exchange could be personal, trust mattered, reputation mattered, and remembering who had helped whom could be just as useful as owning a valuable object. But this created another problem. What happens when trade grows beyond a small group of people who already know each other? When goods start moving between distant communities, you cannot always depend on personal trust. You need something that more people recognize as valuable. And that is when ancient humans began finding surprisingly clever ways to make exchange work even when nobody had money. The easiest way to imagine ancient trade is to picture two people standing face to face, each holding something the other wants. One has fish, the other has grain. They agree on the exchange and both walk away happy. But real life was rarely that simple. The bigger the community became, the harder it was to find a perfect match between what you had and what someone else wanted. Imagine you have a basket full of grain after a good harvest. You need a stone axe, but the person who makes axes already has plenty of grain. They want animal skins instead. You have no skins. Now your grain is still valuable, the axe is still valuable, and the other person still needs something. But the direct trade has stopped. You need another step. So humans began looking for things that other people were willing to accept, even when they did not personally need them at that exact moment. That could be something useful, something rare, something difficult to obtain, or something that had become widely recognized within a community. The object did not necessarily have to be money. It simply had to be something people trusted, others would accept later. This changed the entire idea of exchange. You no longer had to trade directly for the exact thing you wanted. You could first receive something that other people valued, and then use that thing in another exchange. Your grain could become salt. The salt could become animal skins. The skins could eventually become the tool you actually needed. The trade had become a chain instead of a single swap. This also explains why certain goods became especially important in different societies. Salt was valuable in many places because it was useful for preserving food and could be difficult to obtain in some regions. Animal skins could provide clothing and protection. Shells, beads, stones, metals, and other objects could become desirable because they were rare, attractive, useful, or difficult to produce. But there was a catch. Something being useful did not automatically make it a good medium for trade. Imagine trying to carry a huge amount of grain across a long journey just because you wanted to exchange it for something else. Grain can spoil, it takes up space, and dividing it into smaller amounts can be inconvenient. Livestock has another problem. A cow is valuable, but you cannot easily cut off a small piece of a cow to buy a meal. The perfect trading object needed more than value. It needed to be portable, recognizable, and useful enough that other people would accept it. And once humans started searching for objects that could work this way, something very interesting happened. They began discovering that value did not have to come from what an object could do. Sometimes, value came from what everyone agreed it was worth, and that idea would eventually change trade forever. Imagine you are carrying something that you do not really need. Maybe it is a rare shell, a piece of salt, a polished stone, or a useful material that took time to collect. You could eat it, use it, or simply keep it. But someone else might look at it and see something completely different. They might be willing to give you food, tools, or something else you need just to get it from you. That is when an object stops being valuable only because of what it can do and starts becoming valuable because other people want it. This idea was incredibly important for ancient trade. A useful object could be accepted by more than one person, even when those people had completely different needs. If enough people believed that something was desirable, it could move from one person to another many times. You did not have to know exactly what you would eventually get for it. You only needed to believe that someone else would want it later. This is one reason objects such as shells and beads appear in ancient archaeological sites far from the places where they were originally collected. Some shells could be gathered only in particular coastal environments. Yet, examples have been found hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from their natural sources. Their movement shows that people were carrying valuable objects across long distances and exchanging them with communities that could not easily obtain those objects themselves. But there is an important difference between something being used as money and something simply being valuable. Archaeologists cannot look at a shell or bead and automatically say, "This was money." An object might have been used for decoration, social status, ritual purposes, gifts, or trade. Its exact role depended on the culture and the period. The same thing happened with metals. Copper, silver, and gold could become highly desirable because they were durable, portable, and visually distinctive. But before coins existed, a piece of metal did not automatically have a fixed value printed onto it. People still had to judge its weight, quality, and usefulness. That created another problem. If two people agree that a piece of metal is valuable, how much is it worth? What if one piece is heavier? What if another contains a different amount of valuable material? Without standardized units, every exchange could require another negotiation. Humans were slowly moving toward a new idea. Instead of asking only, "What is this object worth to me?" people could begin asking, "What will other people accept this for?" That shift sounds small, but it changed everything. Because once a community begins sharing an idea about value, trade can grow far beyond simple one-to-one exchanges. A person can accept something today because they know someone else will probably accept it tomorrow. And that leads to the next problem, one that becomes even more important when strangers start trading with each other. How do you trust the value of something when you have never met the person offering it to you? Trust became one of the most important parts of ancient trade. If you were exchanging food with someone you knew well, you already had a reason to believe they would keep their side of the deal. But imagine meeting someone from a distant community for the first time. You do not know them. You do not know what their goods are worth in their community. You do not even know whether they will return the favor later. Suddenly, trading is not just about having something valuable. It is about deciding whether the other person can be trusted. This is where relationships could become more valuable than the object being exchanged. People who traded with the same families or communities again and again could build reputations. If someone consistently kept their promises, others had a reason to treat them again. If someone cheated people, word could spread and future exchanges could become much harder. In a small community, reputation was not something you could easily escape. Trade could also happen through gifts and obligations rather than immediate exchange. A person might give food to another family without receiving an equal object at that exact moment. That did not necessarily mean the food had no value. The expectation could be that the favor would be returned later. In some societies, giving and receiving created social obligations that helped strengthen relationships between families and communities. This kind of exchange could continue even when nobody had a fixed price for anything. There might be no rule saying that one basket of grain always equaled a certain amount of meat. The value depended on the situation, the relationship, the scarcity of the goods, and what both sides were willing to accept. Scarcity could make a huge difference. If food was easy to find, people might not offer much for it. But after a poor season, the same food could become extremely valuable. Something that seemed ordinary in one place could be rare somewhere else. A material that was easy to collect near the coast could become highly desirable hundreds of kilometers inland. This is one reason ancient trade networks could stretch surprisingly far. People did not need to carry every object directly from its original source to its final destination. Goods could pass through many hands. One community might exchange something with another, which passed it to a third, and eventually the object could travel far beyond the place where it was first collected. Archaeology gives us clues about this process. Materials found far from their natural sources can show that people were moving goods across large distances long before modern transportation existed. Obsidian is a particularly useful example because its chemical composition can sometimes reveal where the volcanic stone originally came from. When obsidian appears at an archaeological site far from that source, it provides evidence of movement and exchange between communities. But long-distance trade created an even bigger challenge. The farther an object traveled, the more people had to trust that it would remain valuable. A shell collected near one coastline might be exchanged several times before reaching someone living hundreds of kilometers away. Each person had to believe that another person would want it later. That shared expectation could keep an object moving even when none of the people involved had any intention of using it themselves. And that is the strange thing about ancient trade. Sometimes the most valuable object was not the one you needed. It was the one you knew someone else would need, but humans eventually found a way to make that idea even more powerful. Instead of relying only on rare objects, useful goods, or personal trust, they began developing things that could be accepted by much larger groups. And once that happened, trade started moving towards something that looked surprisingly close to money, even though actual coins were still nowhere in sight. The problem with valuable goods was that not all of them were easy to carry. Imagine trying to make a long journey while carrying bags of grain, several animals, or piles of useful materials just because you might need them for another trade. The farther you traveled, the more inconvenient this became. Ancient traders needed things that were easier to move, easier to recognize, and useful to people beyond their own community. This is one reason small objects could become surprisingly important in ancient exchange. Beads, shells, pieces of metal, and other portable goods could travel much more easily than large supplies of food. They could also be stored for later. A trader did not have to use them immediately. They could keep them until they found someone willing to exchange them for something they actually needed. Salt was another interesting example. In places where salt was difficult to obtain, it could be extremely useful because it helped preserve food and was needed by the human body. But it would be wrong to say that salt was simply ancient money. Different societies used different systems, and an object could be valuable without functioning as a formal currency. The same is true of shells. Some shell types became important objects of exchange in different parts of the world, but their role varied widely across cultures and time periods. What made them useful was not some universal rule that every ancient human agreed on. Their value came from the people who accepted them. That idea is the key. Money does not become useful simply because an object is rare. It becomes useful when people believe other people will accept it too. Think about what that means. If you are carrying something that nobody else wants, its rarity does not help you much. But if thousands of people recognize its value, suddenly that same object can move from person to person without anyone needing to use it immediately. This made trade much more flexible. You could receive something today and save it for a future exchange. You could travel to another community and hope that people there would accept it. You could exchange goods without needing to find the exact person who wanted what you originally had. But there was still a serious weakness. How could people agree on the amount? If one trader offered a piece of metal, how did everyone know how much valuable metal it contained? If someone offered grain, how much grain was enough? If the object was valuable because of its weight, how could people measure that weight accurately? The answer was not just more trust. Humans started developing ways to measure and standardize value. And once value could be measured more consistently, ancient trade was about to enter a completely different stage. Once people started trading goods over longer distances, simply agreeing that something was valuable was no longer enough. Traders also needed a way to compare quantities. If two pieces of metal looked similar, one might still contain much more valuable material than the other. If someone offered grain, the amount mattered. If someone offered livestock, its size, age, and condition could change what people were willing to give in return. Wool became one useful way to solve this problem. Instead of treating every piece of metal as completely different, traders could measure how much metal they actually had. This made exchanges easier to compare. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, silver was used in economic transactions long before the first coins appeared. It could be weighed and used to measure value, while actual goods could still be exchanged in everyday life. This was an important step because it separated the idea of value from the physical object itself. A piece of silver did not need to be shaped like a coin to be useful in an exchange. Its weight and quality could matter more than its shape. People could measure it, compare it, and agree on how much was being exchanged. But measuring value created another problem. What if every trader used different weights? One person's idea of a certain amount could be different from another person's. So societies began developing standardized weights and measures. Once people could agree on common units, trade became much easier because both sides had a shared way to judge quantities. This did not mean ancient trade suddenly became simple. Goods still had different values in different places, and people still had to negotiate. But standard measurements removed one major source of confusion. A trader no longer had to rely entirely on the size or appearance of an object. They could measure it, and this is where the story gets really interesting. Humans had already found ways to trade without money. They had used goods, gifts, relationships, valuable objects, and measured quantities. But eventually, societies discovered that they could take the next step and create an object whose main purpose was to represent a standardized amount of value. That object was the coin, and when coins appeared, ancient humans did not suddenly invent the idea of trade. They were solving a problem that had existed for thousands of years. How do you make everyone agree on what something is worth? Coins did not suddenly appear because ancient humans forgot how to barter. By the time the first coins were created, people had already been trading goods, measuring value, using metals, and building systems of trust for a very long time. Coins solved a different problem. They made value easier to recognize and exchange. The earliest widely recognized coins appeared in Lydia, in western Anatolia, around the 7th century BCE. They were made from electrum, a naturally occurring mixture of gold and silver. What made them different from an ordinary piece of metal was the official mark stamped onto them. That mark helped show that the piece had been issued under an authority and was meant to represent a known value. This changed the experience of trade. A trader no longer had to inspect every piece of metal and negotiate entirely from scratch. A stamped coin could carry information with it. Its weight and metal content still mattered, but the official mark added something new: confidence that the coin belonged to a recognized monetary system that did not make barter disappear overnight. People continued exchanging goods directly, and different forms of payment existed side by side. Coins were simply another tool, but they had one major advantage. They were small, portable, divisible into different denominations, and easier to use in repeated transactions than many bulky goods. Now imagine the difference. Instead of carrying a large amount of grain because you might need to trade it later, you could carry a small number of coins. Instead of finding someone who specifically wanted your grain, you could sell the grain for coins and then use those coins with someone else. The trade no longer depended on finding the perfect match. That was the real breakthrough. Money did not make humans start trading. Humans had been trading long before money existed. Money made the process more flexible by giving people something that could move between many different exchanges. And this finally explains the mystery behind the original question. Ancient humans did not need money to trade because they had already developed other ways to solve the problem. They used goods, gifts, obligations, trust, valuable objects, measured quantities, and eventually standardized forms of value. Coins were not the beginning of trade. They were the result of humans trying to make an old problem easier, and that same problem is still sitting underneath almost every purchase we make today. By the time long-distance trade became more common, an object could travel far beyond the place where it was first produced. A piece of obsidian, for example, could be carried away from its volcanic source and eventually appear at an archaeological site many kilometers away. Because obsidian has distinctive chemical properties, archaeologists can sometimes compare it with known sources and work out where the stone originally came from. These discoveries show that ancient communities were not isolated groups simply producing everything they needed for themselves. Trade could connect people who lived very different lives. A coastal community might have access to shells and marine products, while people farther inland could have food, stone, animals, or other resources that were difficult to obtain near the coast. Neither group needed to produce everything on its own. They could exchange what they had for things that were harder to find in their own environment. And the exchange did not have to happen directly between the original producer and the final owner. Goods could pass through several communities. One group could trade an object to another group, which could pass it somewhere else. Every exchange added another link to the chain, allowing valuable materials to travel surprisingly far without any modern transportation system. This also explains why ancient trade was about much more than survival. Some objects moved long distances even when they were not essential for food or shelter. Beads, shells, pigments, decorative stones, and other unusual materials could become desirable because they carried social or cultural value. Owning something rare could make a person stand out, show connections with distant communities, or signal status. But long-distance trade had a problem that local exchange did not. The farther goods traveled, the more difficult it became to know exactly what they were worth. A material that was common near its source could become rare somewhere else. An object that had little practical use in one community could be highly desirable in another. Value depended heavily on what people were willing to accept. That is why ancient trade was never just about moving objects from one place to another. It was also about moving trust. Every person who accepted an object had to believe that someone else would accept it later. The object could keep moving because people shared an expectation about its value, and that is the part of ancient trade that feels surprisingly familiar today. When you accept money, you usually do not want to keep it forever. You accept it because you expect someone else will accept it from you later. Ancient traders were solving the same basic problem with very different tools. By this point, humans had already created most of the ideas that money would eventually combine into one system. They had learned to exchange goods, build trust, recognize shared value, measure quantities, and move valuable objects across long distances. The final step was not inventing trade. It was making all of these ideas work together. By the time coins appeared, humans had already spent thousands of years figuring out how to exchange things without them. They had learned that direct barter could fail, that trust could make future exchanges possible, that certain objects could become widely accepted, and that weights and measurements could make value easier to compare. Money did not replace all of these ideas. It brought many of them together into one much simpler system. A coin could be carried easily, divided into different values, and recognized by people who trusted the authority that issued it. You no longer needed to find someone who wanted exactly what you had. You could sell your goods for coins and use those coins somewhere else. The person receiving them did not have to want your original goods. They only needed to believe that someone else would accept the coins later. That is the real breakthrough behind money. It was not that ancient humans suddenly discovered that objects could have value. They had understood that for a very long time. The bigger discovery was that a shared form of value could connect thousands of separate exchanges. A farmer could sell grain. A trader could buy it. A craftsman could accept the payment. A traveler could carry it somewhere else. None of these people needed to produce the same thing, know each other personally, or make a direct trade with one another. The system could keep moving because everyone accepted the same idea. And that takes us back to the ancient humans standing there with something valuable in their hands, but no money in their pocket. They did not have our system, but they had already solved the hardest part. They had learned how to make another human being believe that what they were offering was worth something. Thousands of years before coins existed, humans had already found ways to trade, share value, build trust, and move goods across distant communities. Money did not create trade. It simply made an ancient problem easier to solve. Today, we tap a card or phone and barely think about the exchange happening behind it. But the basic idea is still the same. We give something we value because we trust that someone else will accept it in return. If you enjoyed discovering how ancient humans solved everyday problems long before modern technology, subscribe for more stories about how our ancestors survived, traded, explored, and changed the world.